Waging Peace, Global Adventures of a Lifelong Activist by David Hartsough with Joyce Holliday. Chapter 8, Reversing the Blueprint, Saying No to Nukes. We loved our years in Philadelphia, but Jan and I began to realize that the city lacked the natural beauty we were craving. I regularly took Peter and Heidi, then toddlers, on walks on the streets around our home, past all the abandoned cars and broken glass, feeling sad for my children and for myself. Every summer, Jan and I drove our young family 2,000 miles to the beautiful Grand Tetons just to refresh our souls. We decided we wanted to continue the kind of work and community living we had found in Philadelphia, but we were ready for a change of scenery. We spent the summer of 1973 traveling in the West, visiting kindred souls in Colorado, California, Oregon, and Washington. California especially called to us. We spent several days in La Paz with Cesar Chavez and members of the United Farm Workers Union, who were getting up at 4 o'clock every morning to picket in the fields for fair hours and wages, valiantly facing violent men hired by ranch owners determined to beat them into submission. When a job opened up with the American Friends Service Committee in San Francisco in their Simple Living program, Jan and I jumped at the offer and happily moved our family to the West Coast. We shared the position, conducting many weekend workshops, leading participants in confronting out-of-control consumerism and embracing simpler lifestyles. We discovered that similar to other 12-step programs, many Americans could benefit from consumers anonymous groups to support one another in making radical lifestyle changes. Most of us who enter the world as middle-class Americans are essentially handed a blueprint at birth. Cultural expectations about becoming patriotic, self-sufficient consumers are drilled into us from an early age. Reversing the blueprint takes intentional effort over a lifetime. At the end of our workshops, we invited people to consider what they could give, barter, or share with others. Some amazing things happened during those sessions. People agreed to share lawnmowers, tools, even cars, in order to cut down on their possessions. Some decided to get together for a vegetarian potluck meal once a month, to learn new patterns of eating that were less damaging to the planet. One person owned a cabin in the Sierra Mountains and offered to make it available, an invitation that our family and others joyfully accepted. A dentist at one of our workshops offered to take care of my teeth for a few years at no cost to me. I shared with him the nonviolent campaign we were launching to try to stop construction of the Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant, and he joined our protest and got arrested, which he told me was a high point of his life. I think I got the better deal, but he felt that we had shared something very important that benefited both of us. In San Francisco, Jan and I were part of a simple living collective of 10 people who together wrote a book called Taking Charge. The chapters covered such topics as food, energy, work, and community. It included an energy addict's calorie counter, what today we would call a measure of our ecological footprint. We mimeographed the first version. Then it was printed on the press of San Francisco's weekly newspaper, the Bay Guardian. Bantam paperbacks eventually picked it up, and later Harper and Row published a reworked and expanded version titled Taking Charge of Our Lives, Living Responsibly in Today's World. Our protest movement at Diablo Canyon, which began in 1976, was a direct outgrowth of the Simple Living program and the commitments outlined in the book. According to the energy experts, if we wanted to grow in energy consumption at the prevailing exponential rate, we needed more than windmills and the sun. We had to have nuclear power, touted by those in the industry as producing an endless supply of energy, too cheap to meet her. Our campaign at Diablo Canyon was questioning that mentality. We were confronting our nation's superconsumption and raising questions about safety and the choice to mortgage the future of coming generations, which would be forced to deal with nuclear waste that would be radioactive and dangerous for thousands of years. We were opposed to nuclear power in general, but Diablo Canyon had a particular set of compelling issues. Pacific Gas and Electric, PG&E, was building the plant's 2 nuclear reactors on California's pristine coastline near San Luis Obispo over a Chumash Indian burial site. The local Native American tribes were the first to put up a fight against the plant, asserting that the spirits of their ancestors were being violated. The plant site is located along the well-known San Andreas Fault, which increases its susceptibility to earthquakes and the potentiality of the surrounding population's exposure to massive and lethal radiation. In 1972, a Los Angeles reporter discovered a report by Shell Oil Company geologists about the existence of a second fault, the Hartsough Fault, just 2.5 miles offshore of the site. During the Nuclear Regulatory Commission's licensing process for the plant, which was constructed despite our protests, PG&E brought up Shell's geological survey, perhaps in hopes of keeping the public from knowing about the Hartsough Fault. The fault had already produced an earthquake of 7.1 magnitude early in the 20th century, more than Diablo Canyon was designed to withstand. As a result of the discovery of Hartsough and our ongoing efforts to bring this information to light, nuclear regulators made PG&E redesign and reinforce the plant. In addition to its other problems, Diablo Canyon uses seawater to cool its reactors. On several occasions, masses of jellyfish, marine animals, and kelp have obstructed operations, compromising safety and efficiency and forcing a shutdown. In late 1976, members of Mothers for Peace had come to AFSC, American Friends Service Committee, and asked if we could help them build a nonviolent movement to stop construction of the Diablo Canyon plant. They had heard of farmers in Germany who had successfully stopped the construction of a nuclear power plant in Wiel by nonviolently blocking it for 9 months, and they hoped that we could offer similar sustained resistance. We launched the Abalone Alliance in 1977 in honor of the tens of thousands of wild California red abalone that were killed in 1974 in Diablo Cove when the reactor's plumbing had its first hot flush. We were aware of the Clamshell Alliance in New England, which was protesting the Seabrook nuclear power plant on the coast of New Hampshire. We modeled our affinity group-based organizational structure on theirs. Everyone who participated in the Abalone Alliance participated in an 8-hour nonviolent training, and we made our decisions in spokes councils made up of one representative of each affinity group or support group of 8 to 10 people. On August 6, 1977, the anniversary of the US atomic bombing of Hiroshima, 47 of us crossed over the fence at Diablo Canyon using homemade ladders and began walking toward the plant. We were arrested, taken to the county jail, and told that if we didn't pay a $100 fine, we would spend 6 months in jail. But the judge threw our case out of court when it was revealed that 2 police informers had infiltrated our group. The next year, we increased our resistance tenfold. On Hiroshima Day in 1978, 487 people entered the plant site. Some tried to blockade the front entrance. Others tried to convert the plant into a museum of inappropriate technology. And still others set up information tables about alternative energy. One group tried to erect a windmill. We spent a few nights in what we dubbed the Diablo Hilton, which was an old gymnasium that had been converted into a county prison. At our court hearing, I began my statement with these words. I participated in the nonviolent occupation at Diablo Canyon because I love my children, Peter and Heidi. I am concerned that they and their children and future generations should have a chance to live without the dangers from this and other nuclear power plants. I do not want my children to die from cancer or my grandchildren to be deformed because of the carelessness, ego-centeredness, or profit of my generation. I presented the judge with a book written by survivors of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki atomic bombings, expressing my concern about the connection between nuclear power plants and nuclear weapons proliferation. I ended my statement with these words: future generations have no other spokespeople. We will do our best to represent them. Visiting Superior Court Judge Robert D. Carter sentenced 33 of us, the repeat offenders, to 90 days in jail and a $300 fine. The next morning, in a startling reversal, he delivered a dramatic apology to a crowded courtroom in the San Luis Obispo Veterans Memorial Building. This is the first time I have handled a municipal court case, and I must say I handled it badly. He reduced our sentences to 15 days in jail. None of us ever paid our fines. The members of the Abalone Alliance breathed a sigh of relief at the judge's change of heart, and we continued our campaign. The Abalone Alliance was the target of one of the first known SLAPs, SLAPP, Strategic Lawsuit Against Public Participation, in US history. The plaintiffs were San Luis Obispo County and the Pacific Legal Foundation, the oldest conservative public interest law firm in the country, whose motto is rescuing liberty from coast to coast. The goal of a SLAP, intended to intimidate and silence critics by burdening them with the high cost of a legal defense, is generally not for the plaintiffs to win, but to wear down defendants. The lawsuit against the Abalone Alliance lasted 5 years and was withdrawn just before going before the US Supreme Court. The Natural Resources Defense Council responded with a countersuit around harassment of anti-nuclear activists. That's when I petitioned to get my FBI file under the Freedom of Information Act. About 2/3 of it was blacked out and couldn't be read, but there was that first sentence, quote, David Hartsough, the son of Ray Hartsough, organized a vigil at the Nike missile site. That moment seemed like ancient history by then. I was amazed to learn how closely the federal authorities had watched all my activities since 1955. Many celebrities joined our movement to shut down the country's most controversial nuclear power plant. Actors Harrison Ford, Jane Fonda, Robin Williams, Lily Tomlin, Martin Sheen, John Belushi, and others lent their weight to the Diablo Canyon effort. Performers, including Jackson Browne, Joan Baez, Stevie Wonder, Bonnie Raitt, Bruce Springsteen, and James Taylor, held anti-nuclear benefit concerts on our behalf, including a Peace Sunday in the Rose Bowl with more than 100,000 people in attendance. A number of these high-profile individuals got arrested at Diablo Canyon, raising the level of public awareness of our efforts. We staged blockades and occupations at Diablo Canyon from 1977 until 1984, and also organized protests at PG&E offices across California. Support for our cause was building throughout the nation. On April 7th, 1979, 25,000 people marched in San Francisco to demand that construction on the plant be halted. On June 28th of that year, 40,000 people attended a protest rally at Diablo Canyon. On September 10th, 1981, 30,000 people marched along the coastal highway toward the plant. More than 1,960 of us were arrested, the largest number arrested at an anti-nuclear protest in the United States. These included all the members of the San Luis Obispo City Council. Our spirits were high, and musician Wavy Gravy and I organized and acted as MCs for a variety show each evening that we called the Tornado of Talent. Among other arrestees and performers, it featured Jackson Brown, who had been arrested with us. We convinced our guards to allow in an acoustic guitar on the condition that Jackson would leave it there when we left. We knew that Diablo Canyon was bad, but it turned out that things were a lot worse than even we had suspected. A third seismic fault, the shoreline fault, was discovered running directly under the plant. Even more stunning was the revelation that came to us in a note stuck into the jail after our large September 10th protest. A 25-year-old engineer had blown the whistle on a serious construction error at the plant. The blueprints had been reversed during construction. Pacific Gas and Electric eventually disclosed to the public this potentially cataclysmic error. The blueprints for the installation of mandatory seismic safety supports designed to protect the cooling systems of Diablo Canyon's 2 reactors from earthquakes were on a single transparency. One side was for the first reactor, and the reverse side was for the second. But someone forgot to provide instructions to flip it over. Because construction workers failed to reverse the blueprint, some areas in the second reactor were overly reinforced, while others were left without any reinforcement at all. It was a costly mistake requiring a $2.2 billion repair. The original price tag for the plant had been estimated at $300 million. When it finally opened in 1985, construction costs were $5.8 billion, with an additional $7 billion in financing costs, hardly too cheap to meter. Unfortunately, the Abalone Alliance was not successful in preventing the Diablo Canyon nuclear plant from going into operation, but we were successful in shutting down the Humboldt and Rancho Seco plants, and later the San Onofre plant. And due to our efforts and others in the anti-nuclear movement across the country, no new licenses to build nuclear power plants in the United States were issued for over 30 years. During those years, I also became involved with nonviolent efforts to stop further development of nuclear weapons. I participated in nonviolent actions organized by the Nevada Desert Experience, a resistance campaign born from the Franciscan and Catholic worker traditions and the American Peace Test. During Lent, on Hiroshima Day, and at other meaningful times throughout the year, gatherings were held at the Nevada test site in the desert north of Las Vegas, protesting decades of nuclear weapons tests there. During one of these protests, I brought along a carload of people from San Francisco. Among them was a young Palestinian American woman who had been part of the musical The Children of War. This production, which toured the United States and the Soviet Union, was written and performed by young people from countries whose governments had labeled them enemies, Russians and Americans, Palestinians and Israelis, among others. It was a very moving and powerful play. Their message was, we are young people and we want to live. They even met with the presidents of their respective countries to convey their convictions about peace among the nations and their deep concern to stop the madness of the nuclear arms race so that they and all humanity could have a future. This young woman decided to cross the line at the test site and was arrested. Those of us who were adults were processed and released. But because she was 17, she was taken to juvenile hall. The authorities there told me that she could be released only to one of her parents, who were almost 600 miles away back in San Francisco. Our carload stayed in a simple motel in the little desert town of Beatty, Nevada, trying to secure her release. One of the local authorities called on the phone and told me, "There's a warrant out for your arrest for bringing a minor across state lines with the intent to commit a crime." That was a stunning statement coming from an official in a state where prostitution is legal and testing nuclear bombs is legal and stealing land from Native Americans is legal. But bringing someone across the state border who believes nuclear weapons are immoral and illegal under international law and wants to follow her conscience is illegal. I didn't relish facing a felony charge, and I was very torn about what to do. The next morning, we woke up, looked out the motel window, and saw a small army of police cars lined up along the street. So the dilemma was, do I go out the front door with the rest of the group and face the police officers who are going to take me to jail? And if so, what will happen to all these people I brought, including the young woman? Or should I slip out the back door, cross the field, and meet up later with the group? I chose to duck out the back door, an act I had never done before and never have since. When we met up again, we faced the question of whether to cross over into Death Valley in California, where we would avoid the Nevada police, or drive the more convenient route through Nevada to Reno. Hoping we could still retrieve our brave young Palestinian friend, we decided to head north toward Reno, calling back regularly to Beatty to get updates and try to secure her release. Later, we discovered that our stealthy plan had been unnecessary. We found out that some of the police officers lived close to the motel, and their cars had simply been parked out on the street. They had nothing to do with me. The young woman's father eventually had to fly to Beatty to get her released. One year, early in the 1980s, my brother Paul came and was arrested with me at the test site, along with hundreds of others. At our arraignment in the court in Beatty, we were each sentenced to 15 days in jail. So many people had been arrested that the local jails were beyond capacity, so the authorities put us on buses and stopped at every little town going north, dropping some of us off at each local jail and then heading on to the next jail to unload more. Paul, our friend Russ Jorgensen, and I were still on the bus at daybreak, and we saw a beautiful sunrise over Walker Lake. Finally, the last of us ended up in Fallon, Nevada, almost 300 miles from the nuclear test site. The jail was so small that it had no kitchen, and the warden brought in TV dinners for us 3 times a day. We got to know him quite well, and he eventually told us he had served in Vietnam, most of the time on an aircraft carrier loading bombs onto planes. I asked him, "Did you ever think about what happened to those bombs you loaded?" He answered, "Nope, never thought about it." Paul considered my question insensitive, but a couple of days later, when we were sitting on our bunks having a Quaker meeting for worship, the warden came in. He didn't know what we were doing, and he spoke up. "Actually, I wanted you to know that, yes, I did think about it." I thought that was a brave thing to admit to us. At Bangor Submarine Base near Tacoma, Washington, a civil disobedience campaign grew up in resistance to the Trident submarine. My dear friends Jim and Shelley Douglas were among the faithful who protested with persistence for many years. Loaded with 408 independently targeted warheads, each Trident missile is capable of destroying that many cities, with devastation far beyond what was rained down on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Hundreds of us were arrested as we crossed a fence onto the base. We were immediately released. It seemed there were many more of us than the county jail could hold. Another small campaign that I helped to organize was on behalf of DQ University, a tribal community college committed to the celebration and preservation of Native American culture and religion. The college was founded near Davis, California, on the site of a decommissioned U.S. Army communications facility. Citing a federal law that requires surplus federal land to be returned to Native Americans, organizers and future students jumped the fence and claimed the unused property for their school. After lengthy negotiations, the federal government granted DQ University title to the land in 1971. That same year, federal officials forcibly ended the 19-month occupation of Alcatraz Island by Native Americans, who had appealed to the same federal law and claimed title to the island off San Francisco after the infamous federal penitentiary there closed. 2 years later, in 1973, members of the American Indian movement and federal law enforcement officials were embroiled in an armed standoff at Wounded Knee, site of an 1890 massacre on South Dakota's Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, over tribal leadership and the US government's failure to fulfill its treaties with Native Americans. In the wake of this rising Indian activism, the US government threatened to close down DQ University. I had gotten to know several Native American activists, including Russell Means and John Trudell, through various campaigns in California and throughout the Southwest. When federal officials threatened to take over DQ University by force, if the university didn't shut its doors, I had a meeting with several of the school's leaders, whom I had met on previous visits to the campus. We mobilized some of the Abalone Alliance activists and others to go up and encircle the campus. The message was, "Over our bodies will you attack this university." Native Americans had had so much stolen from them that it seemed that the least we could do was nonviolently try to help them keep their university. At the very last minute, the FBI and federal marshals backed down, averting a confrontation and allowing the university to stay open. In 1981, several of us involved in the Abalone Alliance turned our attention to the nearby University of California's Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, the country's largest research and development center for nuclear and space-launched weaponry. Within its walls, nuclear weapons are brought through the stages of conception, design, and computer simulation. The neutron bomb, which has the capacity to kill massive numbers of people with high doses of radiation while leaving buildings intact, was born at Livermore. So were the warheads for Poseidon, Polaris, and Minuteman III missiles. My parents had moved to a retirement center in Santa Rosa, California by then. Among the highlights for me of our sustained witness at Livermore was my mother's arrest with me on a Good Friday. Both of my parents, in their own ways, had spent their lives caring for others and working for justice and peace, but neither of them had ever been arrested. My mother and I were kneeling with about 100 others in front of the main gate to the weapons lab, praying for the end of nuclear weapons work at Livermore, when we were surrounded by police and handcuffed. The police separated the men from the women for processing, and after they fingerprinted Mom, they released her on a street corner. She couldn't find me, so she got a ride with someone from the demonstration into the town of Livermore. There she was with no ID and no money and no buses running to Santa Rosa. She ended up finding someone to lend her money for a bus ticket to San Francisco, and someone else on the bus walked her to my home. I was very worried about her. I had called the security office at Livermore Lab, as well as the local police. After a few hours, when I didn't know what else I could do, I went on home. I was extremely relieved when, after a few more hours, my mom rang the doorbell and we were reunited. On Easter morning, I got a call from the chief of security at Livermore Lab. He was concerned and wanted to know if I had found my mother. It was quite an act of kindness from an officer who regularly arrested us. I often accompanied older people at our demonstrations, and from that time on, the police never let me get separated from whomever I was accompanying. Among the 1,000 protesters arrested at Livermore Lab in June of 1983 was Daniel Ellsberg. A former military analyst with the RAND Corporation, Dan was most renowned for releasing the top secret Pentagon Papers outlining military decision-making during the Vietnam War, he knew the inside story of nuclear weapons development and had firsthand knowledge that every US president since Harry Truman had made serious threats to use them. While Dan and I were in jail together for a couple of weeks with the 500 other men who had been arrested, an equal number of women were being held in a separate facility, we convened teach-ins and workshops every day, all day long. Other protesters with us held strategy sessions and yoga classes. It was a rich time. We shared our life stories as a way of deepening our sense of community and appreciation of one another. Among the efforts of our Livermore Action Group was the Livermore Conversion Project, which I coordinated for a year. The goal was not only to shut down Livermore as it was, but to put the lab to work on projects that enhance life. We set up opportunities for dialogue between protesters and the scientists developing the bombs inside the lab. Unfortunately, our efforts didn't help two of the local clergy who were in jail with us. Both had congregation members who worked at the lab, and both lost their positions at their churches after their release as a result of their arrests. A few years later, resurrecting our peace Navy from the Vietnam War era, and still a strong believer in having fun and being out in nature while being politically relevant, I invited Daniel Ellsberg to join me in a sailboat in the Suisun Bay. Located on the bay is Port Chicago, the shipping point of the Concord Naval Weapons Station, yet another vital center of the war-making effort in our neighborhood. During the Vietnam War, 80% of the bombs dropped on Vietnam began their journey at the massive 13,000-acre weapons station, the largest nuclear weapons storage area in the West and the largest munitions depot in the country. During the People's Blockade in the early 1970s, a friend and I paddled our kayaks to Port Chicago in pursuit of ships being loaded with bombs headed for Vietnam. We got close enough to see the ships, but the seas were too rough to try to block them. A decade later, a friend in the US Navy called to say that a ship was leaving Port Chicago for El Salvador with enough ammunition to kill 20,000 people. Friends and I decided to launch another peace flotilla of canoes, kayaks, and small sailboats. We had to cover 2 miles of rough sea to reach the ship. Dan had never been in a sailboat before, and mine was small, only 9 feet long, more like a rowboat with a sail. As we were being pitched about in the strong 10-foot-high waves, I realized that it had perhaps been a bad idea to invite him. One picture of us in a trough of water showed only the top of my boat's mast. Fortunately, we were wearing life preservers. We were closing in on the ship when a wave overturned us. A boat carrying reporters was close by, and the pilot gunned the engine to back up and get the perfect picture of Daniel Ellsberg bobbing in the water. Gunning the engine created a wake that pulled Dan underwater. I fished him out of the bay while the media got their photos. The next day's headline was, "Media Boat Saves Daniel Ellsberg's Life." From my perspective, it was the media boat that had almost drowned my dear friend. My little boat was picked up by the Coast Guard. However, this time they gave it right back. Apparently, this one wasn't worth anything to them. The Peace Navy went on to do many actions, including trying to block the aircraft carrier, the USS Enterprise. I eventually bought a 17-foot sailboat and christened it the Oscar Romero in honor of El Salvador's intrepid Archbishop. A decade before, the Vietnam War had finally ground to a halt, but other wars had begun. El Salvador and the other nations of Central America were engulfed in violence. Their conflicts were being fanned into blazing flames by US funds and weapons. I decided that I needed to go and see for myself the impact of US policy on our embattled neighbors to the south.